Hi, welcome to the California CEDAR sponsored Communities of Practice series. CEDAR, which stands for Collaboration for Effective Educator Development, Accountability, and Reform, is a national center based at the University of Florida and has a mission to support students with disabilities in achieving college and career-ready standards. For those wanting to know more, please visit cedar.org. That's CEEDAR.org. This webinar series aims to share information that supports educator preparation programs in redesign efforts grounded in inclusive practice. The topics include teacher performance assessment, preparation and requirements, traumatic brain injury, extensive support needs and inclusion, and dyslexia. And we have more topics coming soon. We hope you find the information and resources helpful.
Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here. We have invited you here today to hear from a special guest, Dr. Kaylene Case, who's going to share with us about what special educators need to know about traumatic brain injury. My name's Amy Hanreddy, and I am one of many members here from our Cedar, California Community of Practice. And this is the first in a series of webinars related to the transition to the new California Education Specialist Teacher Performance Expectations. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview, and then we will work on diving right in. As I said, I'm Amy Hanreddy. I am based at California State University, Northridge. And I thought, why don't we just we have several members of our Cedar, California team here. And I wanted to see maybe if you just want to raise your hands, and we'll do a really quick shout out for those people. I'm looking at my other screen. So we've got Dr. Annie Spillane. We have Linda Blanton, who is our representative from Cedar in Florida. Kate Adams from Cedar in Florida. Ginny Kennedy, another member of our Cedar, California team. We have Amanda Salazar, who is, oh, there's Linda Smetana. Thank you. I see you, Linda. Another member of our team, Amanda Salazar, is our student assistant, who's going to be helping us out today by dropping some links in the chat and helping things to run kind of smoothly in general. She's a pro at all of this. And so the majority of our time will be spent hearing from Dr. Case, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that we will have opportunity at the end for both question and answer, but also discussion as we think about application of these concepts related to TBI, to our programs, to teacher preparation in general, and to practice in the field. So please start thinking about your questions or your comments or considerations, and you can go ahead and throw those into the chat early so that we can make sure to incorporate them into the discussion once we get there. And just a really quick overview of Cedar, California. So Cedar is a national technical assistance center focused on building the capacity of state personnel prep systems to prepare teachers and leaders to implement evidence-based practices within multi-tiered systems of support. And we have, as part of our state Cedar, California team, we have had this year and rolling into next year 4 key areas that we've been focusing on. So one of those is inclusive principal leadership. Another is a series on critical collaboration and building collaboration across stakeholders related to inclusive practices. We have a group that's focused on expanding resources for serving students with extensive support needs within our teacher prep programs. And then we have this group that's hosting this talk today, which is our Community of Practice series. And this is a set of webinars that are all focused on supporting the transition to our new education specialist standards. And as a very quick overview, just in case we might have some attendees who are not familiar or as familiar yet with those new education specialist programs that we're implementing, I wanted to give like a 1-minute background. So And there's certainly more history prior to 2016. But as part of this transition, there was in 2016 a statewide task force that created a report on special education and really emphasized some of the needed shifts that should be happening in our both our general educator credentials and our ed specialist or special education credentials in California. The report was titled One System and was really looking at creating more of a common trunk or common expertise across general and special education. But another thing that was highlighted in that report was the emphasis on the problematic emphasis only on eligibility categories within some of our current ed specialist credentials, and the need to broaden the expertise of our special educators in the state of California. And so as a result of that, some of the recommendations that are now being implemented include more overlap between the mild to moderate and extensive support needs special education credentials. And that's reflected now in our new teacher performance expectations that were released in 2018 and will be implemented this fall 2022. So there's really an emphasis now, instead of those eligibility categories, the emphasis is more on the level of support that students might need. And in both mild to moderate and extensive support needs, we have multiple teacher performance expectations that are really emphasizing traumatic brain injury. And for that reason, we really recognize that that is an area in which we need to build more expertise in our teacher preparation programs. Now, let me look at my colleagues and see if there's anything I missed or that they would want to add about that background before we move on. I tried to talk fast because I don't want to take too much of Kaylene's time. Okay, I just saw some thumbs up and nothing else, so I'm going to keep going. So I do want to now introduce Dr. Kaylene Case. And I'm putting her bio up. She comes to us with a ton of experience, and I'll let her add in her introduction of herself too. But I just wanted to share the story of how I came to meet Kaylene, because it was really a result of those changes to our ed specialist programs that in this work with Cedar, California, we recognized that we really needed more expertise on traumatic brain injury, and not knowing anybody within our immediate network who really had the expertise that needed to come in, I just started doing some searching and came across this perfect dissertation that was the perfect match for exactly the level of expertise that we needed. And I reached out to the author of that dissertation, which was Dr. Case, and then was so excited to meet her and learn about, since that dissertation, all of the work that she has been doing in the area of traumatic brain injury, but really specifically in terms of application in school settings and relevance for educators, which was exactly what we needed to better address those teacher performance expectations, but most importantly, to make sure that our special educators are well prepared to serve students with traumatic brain injury. So Kaylene, I'm going to turn it over to you. And while I do that, I'm going to switch over to your slides.
Sounds great. Amy, thank you so much for the opportunity to connect. I'm really grateful to partner with you and the team and this amazing work we're doing. TBI, as well as a lot of neurodevelopmental things, are in our invisible backpack, and we come across them in schools, and we often don't have information foundationally in our program. So it was a passion that I had as a grad student when I wrote my dissertation, and it warmed my heart when you reached out to me that you had read it, that it is relevant, and I have continued to let that be a driving focus of my practice. Right now, I practice as a school psychologist and a district behavior specialist in the state of Colorado, and I do sit on a Brain Steps Committee for the state. Our call letters are the same as California: CDE, Colorado Department of Ed, California Department of Ed. So I've had a lot of time working with amazing mentors and seminal people in the field. And my hope today is to share out a little bit that aligns with some of these new standards that we're bringing in as we're looking at programs for our teachers. Um, Today, I believe we have about an hour that I'm going to go ahead and talk. We are recording this, so it will be at your discretion and disposal to access as you need. And we want to make sure that this is interactive and that we're leaving some time to really connect and ask questions that are on the forefront of your mind. And let's have a synthesis of knowledge as we go through the information together. About 20 to 30 minutes. I showed that we'll be wrapping up around 1 o'clock Pacific time. Is that correct? Beautiful. The highlights that I'm going to do on this presentation when I consulted with Amy is we wanted to really talk about traumatic brain injury and go over what is it, how are we defining it, specifically in the realm of special education and in our educational field. We wanted to take a look at current research trends. Super excited. I've been in the field for a while, and our research for the brain is so dynamic and rapidly changing. And it is very exciting to see how multidisciplinary professionals are overlaying their knowledge and expertise to really serve our students. The engineering, the mathematical calculations, the way we understand the complex integrated unit of the brain is really a passion and fascinating. So I'm going to go over some of the new information that we know right now. And I'm excited to say I know it will change. What we know right now is for now, and it will change as we continue on this journey. I do want to provide you with a few resources for TBI. Instructional strategies are something we always hear when we do our PDs and we're in the educational setting. Well, great, that was a PD. Now what do I do? So my hope and my goal as we connect today is to really give some useful strategies that we can apply right here, right now, and expand when we think about our individual practices and different grade levels. So that's what we're going to do. Is there anything I missed that you would like me to cover that I did not highlight? Okay, I see some collective notes. Okay, we'll go into the next slide. And I think a good place that we'll start is what the definition is of a traumatic brain injury. So we've got this definition here for you. It disrupts normal functioning of the brain. It can be a bump, blow, or a jolt to the head, and it causes the traumatic brain injury. The interesting thing is that the younger a child is when they have the injury, we have long-term effects, and that's because the neural networks are still developing. We do quantify brain injuries on categories of mild, moderate, and severe. Mild TBIs are also known as concussions. They tend to be the most frequently occurring as we're encountering our school-aged children. When we think of traumatic brain injuries, there's a variety that can happen. You may have heard of closed head or open head injuries. Those are where something externally penetrates the skull and it goes into the skull for the open head injury, or it's hit the head hard enough that it remained closed. It didn't puncture the bone, but it's still considered a closed head injury. Another thing that happens is axonal shearing, which is where there is such an abrupt movement, a coup, counter coup. Think of a whiplash car accident or a significant fall, whereas the brain moves inside the skull, which I want to make sure we all are aware. If you think of like a cave with the stalactites, the inside of our skull is very rough. There's spikes, there's spheres. It is not a smooth surface like on the outside of your skull. So when our brain has impact where it moves, it gets shook up in there and it can have some significant injury. Something that also happens because of the physical momentum, there's so many hormones going through our brain for our electrical networks to work in our everyday living that we can have metabolic imbalances that can cause impairment. Some other things that happen through various injuries is bleeding and bruising. We bump our head, we can have an internal bleed that can leak out and affect the brain. Moving into anoxic brain injury, which is another type of injury, that deals with oxygen. So if we're anoxic, we have no oxygen. So think of someone who drowned or had a near drowning experience where they were without oxygen for a period of time. That could be an anoxic injury. Hypoxic is where you have very limited oxygen. So for older children who huff or do inhalants or different types of drugs, they can interfere with their body's ability to absorb the oxygen. So it's such a low level that it can actually damage the brain. Teratogens are any toxic things in the environment that can also impair our brain. That would fall under anoxic. A couple things I like to highlight as we go through this area is just because someone does not lose consciousness, that does not determine the severity of the brain injury. So it really is about uniquely what happened to that individual upon the impact or the event that led to the brain injury. And something that's also a fun point I like to share out is that we don't always see brain injury on all of the different imaging. Imaging's come a long way in the last even 3 to 5 years, but we still don't always pick it all up. On some of our mild traumatic brain injuries in schools, we as educators are really adept at knowing what's a little off for our students. And we maybe are not able to put our finger on it, but if we pay attention to subtle differences and we look at a student that potentially had a mild brain injury, if we look at their processing speed, that's often a telltale sign that they've had some impact. So any questions on that? Okay. Some things we want to consider as we move into factors of the brain injury. Why is it important? What can happen? So with the factors of a brain injury that we want to consider, we want to think about the age at the time of injury. We want to look at what that severity was over the things that we just talked about. The family and environmental factors, this is really huge, especially if you think of, we used to know of something called shaken baby syndrome. It's now abusive head trauma. So if there's been child abuse and a young infant or a young child has been shook, a lot of times we don't know about those injuries, but damage has been done. So sometimes it's that silent, quiet thing. And because of the mechanism of how the TBI occurred, we may not have that information. Sometimes people just don't have the resources or the ability to get care. And so it silently manifests as we go on. We'll learn that the earlier we have a TBI, as our brain network and neural wiring is laying down and developing, we can have what we call latent effects, which is where we grow into the injury, meaning that the child may look like, hey, they recovered, everything's looking great. But then when we come to a specific developmental milestone, we might see some lagging skills and some difficulties. And if we do some backward mapping that we'll get into, we're going to be able to overlay and have a roadmap to connect that. And the reason that's important is if we align the right intervention at the right time for our students, we're going to have success and we're maximizing their learning. So that's really important. Those individual characteristics are also something to consider. Sometimes we have our little movers, those kids that really like to have that risk-taking behavior, and they're oftentimes more likely to be at risk for having a head injury. So we look at that. What was their learning style before? If they had the head injury, were they already being staffed? Were they needing some specific accommodations? Did they have something else that was impairing them before the brain injury? So think about that. And something that really stands out to me as I started the research is we don't have a lot of clinical trials or research that shows from the start to the end point for our child outcomes. So looking at current stuff here in 2022, we know we definitely need more research to better understand what those outcomes are. So I'll just put that out there for those of you who are scholars who may want to jump in. When you look at IDEA, which is how children are getting services from us in schools, under the special education, TBI became its own standalone disability category in 1990. So it's been around for a little while, but it's not often used. The opportunity for school special ed teams to identify a TBI is less than 1%. So we know that when we link our research with what's happening in the emergency room, how many TBIs are being reported, and that roughly 15% are needing specialized instruction supports. We're missing them when we get to the school door. So that's part of why we're trying to increase this knowledge. This link that we just clicked on, that's the actual IDEA definition. I won't read the whole thing to you, but the big piece is we have to have a credible or medical history that the student has had a TBI, and we have to be able to link the educational impairment or difficulties that the student is having directly to the TBI to qualify under special education services. But something that I thought might be interesting for us as a group of educators is look at all the different areas that we can see impairment in. It could be memory, it could be language, it can be cognition, it could be physical problem solving. It really truly can impact many different areas. So I just wanted to bring that to the forefront, and that's the federal guideline that we use within school systems. The next thing I wanted to do is I took a look at what's going on in California. We know that if we have TBIs, particularly moderate and severe levels, it can last a lifetime. We think about improvement, not necessarily recovery, because of the way our neural networks are lined up. So, the good news I want all of you to hear is most of our children, remember, most are getting concussions or those mild traumatic brain injuries, they're going to resolve with very little effect. Generally, we see a resolution within 4 weeks, and the resolution is high. 98% are returning back to baseline. So, that is the hope, but we want to have our lens and our detective hat out for our ones that fall into the ones that don't resolve as hoped, or they're more moderate or severe. So when I look at California's special ed, we had just under 800,000 individuals that were getting services in 18 and 19. That was the most recent numbers your department had up. And of those, we had about 1,500 that were identified with TBI. So if you look at the numbers, it's 0.001. Nationally, the reason we're trying to raise awareness is that it's often not at the forefront of our minds, and it's typically less than 1% of identified special education categories. So we want to really raise awareness so that we're looking at everything again to pair the right intervention for the student that might be in need. Looking at the next thing, when you think of our schools and the way our education systems are set up, we often have our problem solving meetings. We have our grade level team meetings where we plan and we problem solve around different needs that students are presenting. Many schools are using multi-tiered systems of support. And I just wanted to kind of use this lens with TBI when you think about what we would do universally in schools as we're raising that awareness. Potentially, we might be asking questions if there's a history of a student bumping their head, just in one of our standard kind of nurse forms that we do when students start, just so that we raise our awareness at a universal level, targeting, looking at the details of when the student got the injury, what their learning style was, what were their pre-existing conditions, what are we seeing now. Really, I just want to highlight again bringing that lens in, because with TBI, we're going to be doing a lot of what we call antecedent management, which is setting the stage for success. Sometimes with the injuries that we incur with the brain impact, we're not able to understand consequences or have emotional responses that are in line with what we would expect to see under typical development. So I just wanted to highlight that. Through the MTSS process, I have found in my own practice, and as I've consulted with many different schools, that if we don't bring that lens in of specifically what neurodevelopmental lagging skill is impacting the problem we're seeing, whether it's academic or behavior, it's difficult to bring in that right intervention that's going to enhance their skill development and really help them access their education as students with brain injuries. The psychological process is always something that we're wondering about. My background is a school psychology. In all of our tests we're doing, what's the psychological process of learning? Where's their memory breaking down? How are they doing new learning? How are they applying it? How are they making connections? Can they bring in abstract learning? So always thinking about that. And I just have a question. Can we see by a show of hands, are you guys using MTSS in the training as your students are out there and you're out in the systems in California? Yeah. So the intensive obviously would be, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and that's actually, so Cedar, California has also supported quite a bit of work around MTSS in the state of California. Also, there's a big conference, big annual conference in July that is all focused on MTSS.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's a really great framework for so many things. And we'll just add brain injury to that as we put our detective hats on. So the next area that I really wanted to talk about, because this is for our educators, what does it look like in our classroom? Why do we want to know? And interestingly, in the research, did you know that teachers are going to be the #1 source to help our students recover and rehabilitate from brain injury? So when they're released from the hospital, if they've had a more severe or moderate. You can go to the next slide if you'd like, Amy. They've had a more severe or moderate injury, they come into our schools. And so that transition and that streamline of communication is going to be really important. Really paying attention to those symptoms and what we're seeing, because remember, it's going to affect all areas of the brain. So is our student more fatigued? Do they have physical ailments? Are they having difficulty presenting what they previously knew before the injury? Do they just seem out of sorts? I think teachers are such great resources because they really know their students, their family community. So just raising that awareness. And this is why we're excited about expanding this is with teachers on board, we're going to really be able to find these kiddos that need the extra support and get them the help that they need. Going into our next slide, why is it relevant? We always want to know what's the why behind it. Being that largest group of professionals is pretty huge. As I said earlier, we have 15% of all students that are in public education receive special ed. And there's going to be certain pockets that we have higher numbers of that for various reasons based on how the community is looking. But overall, in America, 7.2 million kids are getting special ed, a lot of children. With less than 0.5% with TBI, we really want to make sure we're identifying our kids correctly, calling it TBI and not another disability category so that we can align our teaching with it. I don't know if you guys know, this is kind of astounding to me that TBI still remains a leading cause of death and disability in our American population. And we're actively doing research to better understand those outcomes if that TBI happens to the 3-year-old or to the infant or to the teenager, so we know what we can do. Going into the next slide. Um, think about our classrooms. Sometimes we have that kiddo that's got that disruptive behavior that just really wants to derail everybody. I just want to offer that, maybe there's something underneath it. They might have had an injury early on. So emotional regulation, managing social emotional expectations, social mores is maybe not as intuitive or as natural as some of their peers in the classroom. Think about that TBI that maybe happened. I have a couple cases in mind where infants survived abusive head trauma, seemed to recover okay, did okay in preschool. Kindergarten, as things started changing first, second, we started seeing more and more behaviors, and we were able to backward link to the TBI to bring in neurodevelopmental interventions to support them. As I hit on earlier, they're often masked under different special education disabilities. So when I think about my own practice and consultation I've done, many of my students that have been the victim of abusive head trauma, brain injury, and trauma in general are under serious emotional disability. Some are under autism, some are under other health impairments, specific learning disability, without bringing in that lens of TBI. So it can be kind of a Pandora's box. So as we network as educators, it's really going to be important to partner with our multidisciplinary school teams and really have that special ed component available with the gen ed when we're doing our MTSS and problem solving. Going into the next slide, I have a few more statistics I thought might be interesting for this group to share. In 2019, I thought this was interesting. 15% of US high school students self-reported at least one or more sports recreation related concussion within the last 12 months. There were 223,000 TBI related hospitalizations and 64,000 related deaths in 2020. And the thing, again, that stands out to me very strongly is these estimates do not include many TBIs that are only treated in the emergency department. Remember, when you're in the ER, the function is to keep you alive. We're not going into all the small things, the primary care, urgent care. And then there's a handful of them that I really do believe go untreated and are quietly underneath there. And as you build your relationship and your connection with your families and your students, you'll find that sometimes these narratives will come out, whether it's just a gymnastic injury, a fall, or something other. Going into the next slide, we have the brain, as I mentioned earlier, it's an integrative unit. So what I'm going to do now is talk about a few of the research that informs our practice. We have 16 different neurodomains that Dr. Jeannie Dice Lewis put together with her team. We had a state level steering committee, and we put together an educator's manual for TBI, and we use these 16 different neuro domains to guide our thinking. Something that's interesting to me at this time in 2022 is that we really don't have that agreed upon model in current research. And part of that is what I alluded to earlier at the start of our conversation, that research is continually giving us new information. The way we lay down memories, what part of our brain is involved, what areas of our cortexes are giving us our five senses. It's pretty exciting stuff. So I just put in here to remind us that research continues to expand our understanding of the psychological process of learning, healing, but also regenerating in the brain. We go to the next slide. These are some themes that I have found have been consistent over time. So when we're learning a new ability, it always builds on established. So we've got our base or our foundation, if you will. Abilities that are developed at specific stages in life and build the foundation for the expected growth and skill acquisition. So I'm going to give you a couple different ideas around this. When you think of our developmental courses we do in our education field, for example, between ages, let's pick 6 and 12, our elementary kiddos getting ready to go into middle school, they're starting to really understand cause and effect, the relationships, they're ready to learn their academics, they're focusing on their efforts to be able to meet their goals, they're recognizing their intentions and actions. We know that the brain is just going through a lot of different things. And when we've heard, I don't know if you guys have heard of neuronal pruning. When we're first born, we have a ton of neurons, way more than we need. And so use it or lose it. So our body naturally prunes some of our neurons. And the reason for that is it's like bringing a cloudy picture into focus. As we prune our neurons, our neural network of our brain is able to be more specific and clear with intention and targeted skills. So whatever cortex we're using, whatever function we're trying to do, as we do the pruning, we're able to bring those skills on board. So let me think of how I want to say that. If you have an injury in that 6 to 12-year period that I mentioned, we could see that our kids are going to have more emotional dysregulation. They're going to cycle a lot more frequently than what we would typically expect, even though adolescence is known as the stress and storm of development. We could see sleep disturbances, fatigue. So the point is, if I'm learning a new skill and my injury happens, I'm not only going to have difficulty remembering part of that new skill I learned, but I actually might backslide and go back to some lower base level skills and have difficulty coming back on board where I was at. Does that make sense how I said that? Okay. I have some graphs that I'll show because it's kind of interesting. Um, so that's why if if we have a brain injury when we're older, because our neural networks have aligned, they've pruned, they've sharpened, they've been able to practice and really refine their function, we have a lot of compensatory skills that we can pull from. So the younger we are when we have the injury, because we don't have all those skills yet on board, we don't have anything to pull from, and there's a lot of scrambling and disorganization in our mind. So going into the next slide, this is going to be some really basic foundational ideas of how we believe the brain to work. So we develop from the bottom up. So when you think about the base of our brain, occipital, our vision, temporal lobe is going to do language and auditory. Parietal is our somatosensory. And some new research that's really very cool for me, we have our five senses, which we all know, but we also have those interoceptives, what is happening inside of our body. And that information, new research in 2022 is showing fires those neurons in our brain and actually has us store memories and learn skills in different areas that we didn't previously know. So as fMRI residency is coming up, there's a ton of information we can go through. I get lost in the rabbit hole. It's at the end of this slide deck. There's a whole bunch of videos and different things you can go to, but I'm so fascinated that in 2022, it's really like a beautiful lattice and vine and growth that's happening, which is very different than how it used to be taught. When we first did it, it was very simple, like this foundational picture I'm showing you. And we thought, okay, the frontal lobe does my executive functioning. The parietal lobe does my somatosensory. vision is in the occiput. That is true, but that's the very basic. It's the ABCs. And then as we get more involved, we're now being able to write beautiful stories. Let's go into the next slide. So this here is a couple different researchers who were thinking about our brain and our abilities to learn and what happens. And this SAVAGE has been really a seminal body of research that has really driven what we're currently doing right now with application of neuroscience within the field of education. And you could see by these pyramids where we have this large amount of growth and information we're taking in between the ages of 1 and 5. And then it lowers down a little bit. We've got another peak. And you can see how it kind of goes through these dips and valleys. Something that's very exciting that we learned, adolescence. So if you think of our kids that have had a lot of things that have happened to them outside external factors that have really worked against them. Think of trauma, think of adverse childhood experiences. Adolescence is a beautiful time where our neural networks are now really coming alive, and we're finding that there's a lot of neuronal activity that is happening that regenerates and has spontaneous growth. And it's so hopeful because we know that with caring, positive relationships, appropriate interventions and connections, we're able to really teach skills to have children recover and really maximize all of their abilities. So you can hear in my voice, there's just so much hope because we used to not think that in neuroscience. We thought, well, you know, the brain's pretty much set here and that's it. And then we had a couple different theories, and, you know, theories and research will continue to inform, but it's really exciting to see the new adolescent information that's coming out. So we're going to see this pyramid change a little more. Underneath, if you see this dynamic mapping of the human cortical development, I gave you the resources at the end of the slide. It is so impressive what we're learning about the brain. Look at how we can map it out. We can have people think about things and we can see what areas of their brain is lighting up. It is just so exciting to see this merriment of science and imaging and application in school. So we use that to guide us. And then over here, in education, we're familiar with the developmental Erickson, how children were figuring out. We've got your typical development stages, Piaget. I like Erickson and Bronfenbrenner's theory as we overlap into the neuro because it really talks about the impact of the environment on our developing organism, our brain, etc. And I do think that what we're exposed to, what we are seeing, how much we're spoken to. We know what the research says. The more we read to our children get more vocabulary, more experiences. We show that beautiful neural networking and latticing happens so that we can make meaning and connection of the world around us. So, you know, we're grounded in this since the beginning of time. We as humans have been wondering, what makes us go? How do we think? Where's our heart? So these are a few things that guide our practice right now. Let's go into the next slide. This is pretty much agreed upon right now, where we're developing those sensory and vision pathways. So we do those first, as you can see, the bottom up sequence, and then our language comes on board. And then we get those higher cognitive functioning. And at the high level, we've got emotional regulation, control, abstract thinking, and that metacognition, the ability to think about ourselves thinking. If we could go ahead and play this video, this is a quick 3-minute video that Harvard put together. I think does a really nice job to kind of ground us in the research. Thank you.
Kaylene, is this the right one that I'm on?
Yep, that's perfect.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The healthy development of young children in the early years of life literally does provide a foundation for just about all of the challenging social problems that our society and other societies face. What we're learning, not just from behavioral and developmental research, but also now from exciting developments in neuroscience and molecular biology, is how much early experience from birth, in fact, even before birth, how much this experience literally gets into our bodies and shapes our learning capacities, our behaviors, and our physical and mental health. The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting um, the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in the reciprocal relationships that children have with adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their adults. Development and the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back and forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally kind of well put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference. So when we talk about healthy development in the early years, and particularly when we talk about preparing children to succeed in school, we cannot separate cognitive development from social and emotional development. You can't have one without the other. All development builds on what comes before. So when children experience stable, nurturing relationships, it fosters the development of healthy circuitry. And when children experience uncertainty or instability or abusive or neglectful relationships, it literally disrupts the circuitry and the brain's architecture as it's being built. Over time, this has a wear and tear effect. And the more stress you have, the more causes of stress, and the longer your stress response, the more likely you are to have a whole range of problems later on. It can affect the immune system, it can affect the cardiovascular system, and this is why excessive, prolonged stress early in life is associated with a higher prevalence later, not only of learning problems and behavior difficulties, but also physical and mental health problems. Because the brain is optimally flexible and plastic early in life, but as it develops its circuitry and refines its circuitry, it loses some of its flexibility, which is why intervening early is so important, because as we often say, when it comes to brain circuitry, it's better to get it right the first time than to try to fix it later.
Thank you. So I just wanted to lay that foundation because I think as teachers, we have such a beautiful opportunity to really make those connections and intervene early to support our kids. If we go to the next slide, this Harvard study, they're doing a lot of really great work in understanding the brain. Business Insider and different people are taking it. I thought this was an interesting graphic. The age your brain matures at everything. Think about that. We continually learn throughout our life as we're exposed with what we're knowing. But we're best at mastering languages at 5. So shout out with neuro, we should be teaching multi-languages early on in elementary instead of waiting to secondary school. There's a personal bias I'll share. Seeing and hearing, we're on board at 6, so you could see some of these different things. Understanding and responding normally to rewards. The Harvard research is showing age 25. So that's when that prefrontal cortex is more fully developing, and I can use my inhibition to stop and think before I do something. So I thought that might be interesting to you guys. Go ahead and click on the next one. As you can see, we go all the way through. Vocabulary is huge. This makes sense because 67 years, you're exposed to how many words, how much information. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Arithmetic and overall knowledge, age 50, understanding and learning new information. So we continually learn. Our brain is really plastic. It's pretty amazing. Let's go ahead and go on to the next one as I'm watching time. So what we did for educators is we are using this building block of brain development. So taking in all these different theories we've loosely talked about, we wanted to put it in a way that visually is pretty organized and helps us understand how these foundational skills build onto the higher order. So this isn't to say that memory is only down here at this bottom level. Memory actually incorporates and integrates as that lattice all the way up to the overall functioning. But the reason we did the pyramid here is if there is a disruption during that fundamental period, this stability of my pyramid is not there. For example, if there was that injury early on, let's knock the attention block out, then the whole other blocks will cave in on themselves. So it was really a visual that we used at the Colorado Brain Injury Steering Committee to conceptualize how the brain is bringing things on board. I want to pause for a moment because we talked about a lot of theory and some current research. Are there any questions or comments before we move in to some other things?
Can I just add a comment?
Absolutely.
I think that what is so striking to me is, I mean, a lot of this, but the underdiagnosis of traumatic brain injury is very striking to me, and really thinking about how, and I know you're going to get into kind of the more of the educational implications, but the fact that we tend to treat behavioral challenges with a behavioral approach, and the importance of that social emotional piece. So I guess I'm still processing, but I'm just kind of recognizing that that's really relevant and salient, I think, to our teacher candidates.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. And, in my current consulting role, I have 172 cases that I consulted on this past academic year. And of those cases, more than 75% of them had some level of trauma. And in my particular role, I'm called out because extra help is needed because our school-based teams have tried what they know inside and it's not working. And as I dig in deeper, I have had a significant amount, as high as 50%, have TBIs that came out. So when we reframed those interventions and linked the neuro, um, what we do is, when I think of lagging skills through collaborative problem solving, Ross Green's work, we do the same with the brain development. And let's say, for example, the student is lagging in the skill of emotionally regulating themselves. We look at, with the brain injury, at what age did it happen, and then we backward plan so we can put the right interventions in so we can bolster that skill. And we will be going into it. But thank you. I agree with you. It is salient. And I'm really surprised that it continues to still be so under identified. And I often hear from teams, well, they just have a specific learning disability. They have trouble learning, or they're just being manipulative. They just are, it's just that family. So I really want to challenge our lens and our perspective and look at many different alternatives to seek to understand, and to be curious about what the unmet needs of that child is when we see behavior or academic difficulties. Going into our next slide, the research tells us that the best thing we can do, very simple, these four things: clear communication between the outside providers and our community helpers, with school teams and with parents, really coordinating efforts for some of our higher level cases when we have, um, physical needs and equipment that might be used in a more severe TBI, really coordinating all of that with the SPED team and the school team and outside, and monitoring what they look like when they're in the school. This link is a one-page resource that's put together, really nice, that you can have at your disposal. We don't need to click on it, but that's there and it's in the slide deck. Let's go ahead and go down to the next one. Is TBI being the unsolved problem? Tell me more, Polly. Yes, yes, I would say it is the unsolved problem. I see your connection with Ross Green. So it's one of those external factors seeking to understand the holistic student. So yes, I would say it is. Okay, thanks, Polly. It's interesting because TBI, much like trauma, is individualized. So I can't expect students to be the same. So we see certain trajectories with certain things, and we can say, okay, they're going to be at this DRA reading level. We expect they're going to learn these many words. They're going to do this much math, etc. With TBI, it's just so unpredictable what areas of the brain are going to impact the students. A lot of times what I hear from school teams is, oh, Timmy could do this yesterday and today he can't even do it. The performances are really variable and uneven. Particularly in my secondary students, it can be attributed to a lot of different things that could be negative for the student as opposed to understanding the root cause of the concussion from playing sports or a fall or an accident, etc. For our students, it's really hard, especially when they're older and they're going through these really key developmental periods. I had picked adolescent because it's a really tough time for our kids. And I have had a handful that had serious traumatic brain injuries in infancy. It wasn't linked in their educational record. And if you follow them, the disability categories and the interventions and the things that were put into place for them were a lot. I'll just give you kind of a roadmap. ADHD, oppositionally defiant, conduct disorder, and it's all of these different things. And we're missing that there was a lesion from the brain injury that's interrupting the psychological process for them to bring information on to learn. So it's really internal and it's not necessarily inside their control. It's a physiological response, if you will. So as our older kids have more skills, like we talked about in our toolbox, and they get back after their head injury, they can realize there's something not quite right. What used to work for me is not working. And now when I have my stress and storm that's typical of adolescence, hormones are raging, lots of things are changing, I can be really frustrated and really turn in and feel depressed and anxious as a result of things not being as they were. Um, there's a loss. TBI, unlike our other disability categories, is sudden. And it's not something that we really plan for. And it's such a continuum of areas that it can be impacted on. It's a tricky Pandora's box. Let's go ahead and look at our next slide. I wanted to kind of break out, we're going to do for purposes of this training today, the 3 domains that really hit. We'll start with the physical one. Here I've got a list of symptoms that are typically reported from mild all the way up to severe TBI. I'm just going to say when you're in your classroom, some things that you might see is limited ability for them to move their body parts, abnormal muscle tone or ataxia. They can have tremors sometimes on one side. Depending on the severity of the illness, we can have paralysis on the side. I mean, it can really be pretty profound. Sometimes movements are not purposeful. They might need more movement than what they had before. It is automatic, reflexive, and spastic sometimes is how it's described. There might be balance issues for our kiddos coming back with TBIs. They might need help transferring to sitting, walking based on their severity. When we look at that sensory motor part, uh, how do they receive the information? You know, the humming, the buzzing, the sounds of the lights, there can be much more sensitivity from the input that they're receiving as a result of the TBI. We receive information from outside of our body, exteroceptive, and we also receive information interoceptively. So we think about our hearts beating fast if we're nervous, or our stomachs starting to churn when we're hungry. Being aware of what's happening inside our body is that automatic physiological response that cues us to our behavioral or our emotional state. So we just really need that sensory information to organize and to be able to show up with the right amount of information, not too highly aroused, not too sedate, but to be in that right window of tolerance, if you will, to be able to engage in learning. Hearing, I mean, there's just so much that happens physically. Let's go on down to the next slide. For cognitive effects, you can see I have a lot of different things, but talking about that window of tolerance, I highlighted a little bit. When we think of an over-responsive student, they might be really agitated or easily overstimulated from the sensory input. This is pretty common when you return to school early in the TBI healing process. Our students can look like they're more impulsive. They might be more distractible. They're pulled to whatever stimulus is up front, whatever is getting their attention. So sometimes as teachers, that's really hard to manage that 3-ring circus when you have someone that's really over responding to the environment that they're in. So we want to think about how we control that environment, going back to that antecedent management. And then we're going to flip it. We have that under responder, the one that's really decreased. They're really not available to access learning. Let's go back to my middle and high school kids. They got their sunglasses on. Sometimes they got the hoodie. They're slouching. They're pulling back because they're really trying to quiet their room. They can appear zoned out. They have inconsistent abilities to engage in the class, to verbalize, to interact as expected. There's just a lot of different things that can happen. The unexpected responses is something that is really profound. I'll give you an example very cursory. I'm watching our time, but there was a child that was at Children's Hospital when I was doing my postdoc studies, and he survived a severe traumatic brain injury from abusive head trauma when he was 2 months old. He had a variety of impacts from it. He was able to be discharged from the hospital and move into the educational setting. Over the years, he needed specialized instruction and teaching. I won't give you too many details, but here's the unexpected response. In high school, we have a pregnant teacher, 4 months pregnant. He's in class. There's 8 kids in the classroom, and she says, "Hey, can you stay after class?" And the unexpected response as students were leaving, he got up, flipped the desk, threw it, and just had this huge rage. And we didn't understand why. And it was really that neural network and that wiring from his injury that happened at 2 months. He was anticipating and wired for things to not be right because he came from abuse and trauma. So when he was asked to stay behind, even though her intent was not to have any negativity, but rather to complement his work, he didn't know that. So we had this big response right away. So we don't know what's in our students' invisible backpacks. We really have to seek to understand and know, and kind of get into their shoes, if you will. What happens? What do they need to feel safe? So just wanted to bring that up. With the cognitive effects, I think we've covered most of those. I talked earlier in this lesson about the mild TBI, where the information processing speed can be seen. Cognitive fatigue is huge. Sometimes we need to shorten kids' school day because physically, that metabolic balance we mentioned early on, they just don't have the energy to attend for the full day. Oops. Did you have a question, Diana? I saw you talking. Seizures, post-seizure, absolutely. There's a lot of seizure activity for TBI. That's written up quite a bit in the research. That question came from Polly. Memory, memory is a really complex thing. You could see here, simple things, remembering appointments, my assignment, that long-term project. I might need some help doing the graphic organizer so I can make sure that I can stay on time. Thinking about perspective memory, which is remembering to take your medication or make that phone call. Confabulation, I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but it's interesting. Again, think of our secondary students that often get a negative rap. Confabulation is where you are not saying things that are truthful, but the intentionality isn't there. It's really their function of their brain injury when they have this. They're missing gaps in their memory, so they're just trying to put it together. So they're just filling it in. It doesn't have a gain. It's an interesting phenomenon. If you're interested in looking into it, you can Google it and take a look. But we do see that as a cognitive effect as a result of mild, moderate, and severe traumatic brain injuries. Going on to the next slide. The executive functioning, which is like the conductor of all that we do, our judgment, self-awareness, the higher level thinking, we're very familiar with that. And then the next slide. Speech and language deficits we could see. Sometimes my football players, they get the concussion on the side of the head where that part of the brain is. Expressive and receptive language is difficult to make sense of. So making sense of directions, being able to comprehend questions or reading material, concepts. Again, when you look at the chronological age of the student and the complexities of a brain injury, it can be attributed to a lot of different things, but know that receptive language is definitely a skill deficit we see in brain injury. Let's go to the next slide. The expressive language you'll see here. Paraphasic errors where we're just forgetting a word. we don't know what is that thing? I need to use this thing. What is it? Sentence organization, narrative organization, being able to explain what happened, if there's an event, etc. And going to the next one, we're going to go into emotional effects. So cognitive, emotional, and behavioral, physical, we're going to kind of hit those highlights for this. So the emotional, as we talked about a little earlier, we'll go up to emotional effects. Thanks. Irritability, we talked about that. The lability, which is the emotional cycling. Sometimes it can feel like it's a rapid roller coaster, like, whoa, what is going on? This student is really different from where they were. That flat effect, be really aware of that, because there's that loss of, particularly with our older students, they knew where they were, what they had, what they could do, and things have drastically changed. So really watch that. There's their frustration. For younger ones, it can be frustration with the families because, the child isn't doing what they used to do. There's more intense temper tantrums, more difficulty regulating. So it's taxing for, many systems. So again, understanding that root cause. I like that we had some knowledge of Ross Green in our group. I think he's a fantastic framework for us as we're seeking to understand the why behind what children's needs are. Going to the next one. Changes in confidence. You might see kids that were really kind of like that popular, highly peer affiliated, very involved athlete pull back and not want to take those risks because of injuries. You may see them pulling back from their social groups. They may change their peer groups, their sense of belonging, the self-centeredness. No one understands. I'm really stuck. We get a little bit of this in adolescence. It can be intensified with brain injury. Let's go to the next one. Stimulus control. Discontrol is a term you may not be familiar with. Discontrol is where I have that explosive emotional response because a task or a demand was made of me and I simply don't have the skills to meet the expectation or to complete the task. So I'm overwhelmed, I'm dysregulated, and I have a real intense response. Sometimes we can see kids with brain injury get really stuck and they don't want to adjust to changes. Small things like some of our high schools have those AB days, where we do hour and a half or block scheduling is how we call it. Schedule changes that happen can really throw them for a loop. We could see unusual behaviors that we don't typically see. So put that detective hat on. Maybe the student is tapping more, rocking more, just doing something that for them is different. So really that connection and personal relationship we have with our kids as teachers is so important for us to key into what looks different. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. I guess, really as you reflect on the students that you've had in your classroom and you recognize those lagging skills that we talked about and the areas of need, you want to build connection and a sense of safety to really understand the student's background. When that brain injury is a result of abuse, trauma, and or underplayed through various sports activities, because I can't have my child be put out because they've had too many concussions, we're maybe going to miss those opportunities to really connect and have that discussion. So, find ways to kind of gracefully impose that backdoor way in of really knowing what's happening with our children through our different points of entries as we start our new school year, connect with our nurses, our forms. Asking if we bumped our head is a really powerful, simple question that's non-intrusive that can really get the conversation going. For purposes of this, we're not going to go into a lot of depth with the strategies, but we're going to move into that and then we're going to do some question and answers. So as you're thinking about those teaching experiences we talked about earlier, think about a student that stands out to you. Was there a need that you were wondering about when you're thinking about brain injury? Were there certain things you were seeing in the classroom that you're like, I don't know. There's some forms that I am going to have on the links as we move forward. They're going to help us conceptualize those lagging skills I talked about and raise awareness. So we may or may not have time to go through them. I'm looking at about 20 minutes left. So let's go through these last few slides fairly quickly, and then we will jump into Q&A. Does that sound good, Amy? So thinking about strategies as teachers, when you're training teachers, transitions are something we really need to look at. We often have way too many transitions in a school environment for typically developing children, let alone a child with a brain injury. So we likely need supports, during the day. Think about where you can minimize them, where you can support the student. The other idea I want you to think about with transitions is when that student goes from grade to grade, how do we keep that line of communication open so we can continually effectively apply the interventions from the student? Think about elementary to middle school to high school to secondary or preschool into elementary. And then, of course, the other obvious transition is if it's been a more significant injury from the medical setting to the home and then to the school. Let's go ahead and go to our next slide. Those pre-existing conditions, I felt like we talked about a lot, but this is just kind of a placeholder to think about it. I'm going to highlight the family conflict. If you've got a lot going on, think about that domestic abuse and trauma. The abusive head trauma is something it's a big deal for brain injury. So think about that. I think we covered most of these. Let's go to the next slide. This is where the forms are. I think as we go through Q&A, I'm going to welcome our participants to go into the flowchart. But if you could go to that page 78 that we opened up, Amy, just so I can show that piece. It's page 78. So if you see up here, there you go. So as you go through here, I have hyperlinks. This is the Colorado Department of Education manual for educators that we put together at the steering committee. We have the health history form, which guides us through different questions to understand. This brain check survey is going to be various symptoms and things that we can see inside the classroom that stand out to us. So we can look at, it's much like lagging skills for a raw screen. Where is there that need so we can start building in the interventions? For purposes of timing, we won't be able to go through it, but there is a neuro evaluation form that's also hyperlinked in this manual that you can go through, and you can see a variety of resources, symptoms, and interventions as they align. Let's go back to our slide deck. You'll have a lot of fun playing with this. This is the neurocognitive evaluation form. So is our student having difficulty in focus? What can they do? So this is a good form to guide us. For purposes of our timing, secondary is a really big impact. This video is a few minutes. I'd love to share it if we can. I'll look for a thumbs up. It's for concussion. And the thing I love about it, we often don't want to do things. Student voice is so huge. So in my consultation practice, not for us, without us. So this video was created by older students that had suffered concussion, and we put it together to get the message out. And I'd love to share it because I think it's a great teaching point for our teachers and for our classrooms.
A concussion is a type of brain injury. You can't see it. You may not have a bump, a bruise, or even a scratch on your head. All that has to happen for you to get a concussion is for your brain to move around inside your skull. You don't even have to get hit on the head. A jolt or hard slam to your body can make your brain bounce back and forth against the inside of your skull. Getting a concussion doesn't always mean you get knocked out. Less than 1 in 10 people who get a concussion ever lose consciousness. And you can get a concussion in any sport or physical activity, even skateboarding, biking, or snowboarding. The number of sports and recreation concussions every year could be as high as 3.8 million. That's more than the total number of hairs on every monkey ever shot into space in the last 50 years. So what do you do if you feel like you've got a concussion? You could have symptoms like confusion, headache, dizziness, nausea, fatigue, or a general foggy feeling, like your brain has a bad Wi-Fi connection. It's important to report it to your coach, your athletic trainer, your parents, or even a teammate right away. Otherwise, you may end up like Mike. Mike played football. Mike was the team's star player. But after he got a concussion, he continued to play as if he was okay. Bad idea. Since then, things got kind of funny. He thought he was fine, but Mike started having headaches and had a hard time doing the things he used to do, like playing video games. Mike should have told his coach, athletic trainer, or parent and got himself out of the game right away. If you think you may have had a concussion, it's important to see a doctor or a medical professional with experience in sports concussion and not return to activities until they say it's okay. Your brain needs to rest in order to heal. If you don't rest, you could wind up like Jessica. Jessica was an all-star softball player, straight A's, busy social life. In her last game, Jessica slid headfirst into home plate, and her coach took her out of the game because she thought she got a concussion. But she didn't make the right decisions after the game. She didn't get checked out by a healthcare professional, tell her parents about her symptoms, or take the time to rest her mind and her body. Pretty soon, things got weird for her too. Her social life suffered, and she started to forget things, like her date with her boyfriend. So if you don't recognize a concussion, report the symptoms, and take the time to rest, you could miss out on a lot in school, in sports, and in your social life. Concussions can make you moody, too. You might get angry, cry, or act just plain weird for no reason. And you may not even enjoy doing the things you used to like doing. Take the time to rest up completely after a concussion. That may mean no driving, TV, internet, texting, or video games. It's not fun, but it will get you better faster. So, if you think you might have a concussion, remember to 1. Recognize. Know the symptoms and signs of concussion for yourself and your teammates. 2. Report. Tell your coach, athletic trainer, or parents about your symptoms. Get out of the game. Staying in could make it worse for you and your team. And 3. Rest. That means taking time off from sports, your usual activities, and maybe even schoolwork until your doctor or other medical professional says it's okay. But don't worry. Your teammates will step up while you're out, and your teachers can help you. Check out the website for more info on how to get over a concussion and get back in the game.
Going back to the slide deck, we'll highlight just a few interventions and then open us up for comments and questions. While we're going back to slide 41, I see a question in the chat. Who identifies TBI as a qualifying category? That would be your school special ed team. The reason we're bringing this to the teachers is part of that problem solving in MTSS, and a teacher's voice and experience is invaluable. You guys know the kids the best, you're with them. So that's where we're bringing it. But ultimately it is a special education team that makes the qualifying determination under the governing state education laws for TBI. And that's that long definition that we talked about earlier at the beginning. Hope that answers your question, Ms. Polly. So we already talked about growing into the lesion so that, you know, things can happen years away from the TBI. So the big thing is getting that correct diagnosis. Why are we doing this? So we can tailor it and have a successful treatment plan. Going into the interventions for purposes of this training, I'm going to just highlight a few, and then we're going to delve with them into more depth with subsequent asynchronous recordings that we're going to do. So I'm going to review the main areas that are impacted. So we talked about emotional regulation, behavior, and learning. And then we're going to use the brain science sequence of engagement. You may or may not have heard about it. It's from Dr. Bruce Perry's work. We must regulate before we can relate, and then we move into reason. So you think of your three-legged stool. Emotionally, we have to have our needs met. Physically, we have to have our needs met. We have to be regulated to be in that right space to connect, feel safe, and then move into reason so that we can learn. Going back to that other slide real quick, Amy. This is the guiding question for you as educators that I wanted to just really hone in on. What did you know before the injury about the kiddo? What was their learning style? And what was their ability to engage in social activities and regulate those emotions? So as teachers, those are some of your questions as you're monitoring their return to school and their symptoms. Because remember, a child can look like they've recovered, but it still might be invisible with continued what they call latent effects. So that frequent monitoring and that streamlined communication is going to be really important. So now for the meat of it, the interventions, we'll go through these real quick. Emotional regulation, I've got a few here. Increasing that self-awareness is huge, meeting those physical, emotional, and mental needs, because why? That leads to our regulation. Give the student lots of opportunities to regroup, review, and plan for situations. Helping kids identify how they're feeling. Sometimes it's really hard to put a name to it. So if I can't identify how I'm feeling, what's going on inside my body? Where is it that I'm feeling it? What is it that I need? Age appropriate behavior. Sometimes we have to really be very clear and explicitly model what we want to see. We could go ahead and go to the next one. I always like to bring this to my school teams. Sometimes our kids that need the most help ask for it in the most difficult, trying ways. That's really hard when you're juggling everything as a teacher. We ask a lot of our classroom teachers, but I really always try to be curious and wonder what's underneath the behavior. What is that unmet need? What does that student, what are they trying to tell me? So really use that as a guiding principle, and teachers, I think, is a really key thing specifically for behavior. We talked about this earlier. If something's outpacing what my skill set is, you're going to see behavior, both in adults and children. Creating that sense of safety is so huge, that family, that connection that we do as teachers, normalizing that all feelings are okay. And something I particularly love for all students is, you know what? Not yet, but we're going to get there, and we all can practice, and we're all learning that growth mindset. Go to the next one. Here's some highlighted ones that you guys can look at. These are some key that I see often. Remember individualizing it, what's best for the student. Some of my students, if I'm shortening the day or they're having cognitive fatigue, some have it at the beginning because they're on medication, they're not sleeping well, it's hard for them to wake up to get to school. So think about when you're asking those academic demands. Maybe for that student, it needs to be later in the afternoon. Conversely, for a little one, sometimes they start fatiguing after lunch. So maybe I'm shortening their day, or I'm changing the academic demands so that it's a little lighter for them in the afternoon. So really think about your timing and what you're asking of the student. Something that's really powerful is those experiential opportunities, doing the activity with the student to really help them with learning. And something that is so amazing in brain science is if we can get excitement and heighten our level of arousement when we're learning, making it engaging and fun, and we prime it. You know, I'm gonna ask you those math questions. Now remember, do you have your pencil and paper ready? We're gonna go over math questions, and you have kind of that fun sense of play and dialogue with your students. It activates those neurons so that they can be in the right arousal state for learning. Another key thing that I often like to highlight for my educating teams is let students show their learning in a multitude of ways. So does it always have to be written? Maybe they can show, maybe they can write, they can draw, giving them different ways to have those compensatory strategies to meet their needs. Okay, let's go to the next one. Oh, did we do all of them? Maybe we did. All right, so we'll open it up for Q&A, and these are just some of the resources. And then, like I said, coming up, we're going to have 3 more asynchronous trainings, and we're going to go into more teaching strategies, very specific case studies, and linking your resources for the memory, the learning, and the behaviors. We decided when I consulted with Amy that self-concept and emotional well-being for our students is going to be a really big one to spend some time on. So we'll create an asynchronous training for that. And then our families, you know, supporting our system as we have multiple transitions for our kiddos. So we'll have that be our part 3. So that's what we
And
have.
I just want to highlight that these asynchronous trainings, we're going to make them really as resources that you can provide directly to your candidates so that they'll be geared towards teachers and teacher candidates. And these 3 topics are around the 3 priority TPEs, or teacher performance expectations, identified within the new program for both mild, moderate, and extensive support needs education specialist programs. So they are really tailored specifically for use in your classes. And I just want to take a second to thank you, Kaylene, for all of this information. I think this is, I'll just speak for myself that this is an area that I really felt like I was lacking as a special educator preparer. I think that this has been just so useful in providing us context and background to help us to kind of build TBI in a more cohesive way within our programs. And then all of the resources that you have, I think, are just spectacular. But I know we have just a few minutes left, and I don't want to take the time for questions, but thank you so much for all of this.
Well, you're most welcome. Thank you.
Any questions that people have? I know that there were a few during the chat, and I'm sure there's many more. Excuse me.
I'll stop sharing so we can see each other now. I know that Kaylene, you kind of addressed, there was that question, I think it was, I don't know where you are, Polly, but I think it was a great question about, so a lot of this is background, right? A lot of this is helping us to understand the prevalence of TBI and things that we might not recognize as signs of potential TBI. And yet, because most of us are preparing teachers, teachers are not generally the ones providing the diagnosis. I think of our teachers though as the first line, right? So I think that your point is really great, that they are the ones who are most directly interacting with students and are the ones to maybe ask the questions. So if we raise that awareness among our teachers, just like we do with other types of diagnoses and considerations, I think that really helps to recognize the complexity or even the potential that something might be connected to traumatic brain injury. But I wanted to give you a moment if you wanted to add on to that at all.
I see a question in the chat that I will add to. Yes, in my strategies, the part 1 of the asynchronous, I will have a wealth of information that will be for general educators as well as your special ed team. So it will be as much as you want or as little as you want, because some people really like to dive in and other people are like, whoa, I'm drinking from the fire hose. So I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to share a little bit. Thank you. Hanging out in the classroom with my teachers is one of my favorite things to do when I see kids. Teachers are amazing and invaluable.
I'm really curious, this is more of a question for other people attending, but how as we were redesigning our program, we were really thinking about these new TBI, teacher performance expectations, and how we're going to build them in. And I'm wondering if people have kind of thought about how we're increasing that emphasis within our programs at all. So I guess I'm throwing questions back out to the group.
I know that was something that, at our university, when we were looking at this, that it really was an area that kind of everybody went, wow, this isn't an area that we really feel we have a lot of information on. So getting this information is so important to help our educators. And the more you were talking, the more I thought, wow, this really goes all the way down even into those general ed classrooms and helping identify these students early so we can intervene early. That really highlighted the importance of that for me. So I can see not only in our education specialist only classes, but even in our general education programs, disseminating this information is going to be so important. I see Dr. Zoe Bartholomew has their hand up, so I will.
It looks like they're looking for the mute button.
It should be on the bottom left-hand corner. Kimmy, if you have a question, and you want to ask, go ahead. I see your hand is raised. I think you're muted. I thought I turned off.
Oh,
Oh, I
Jan-
thought I turned
Ginny
off.
said that nobody can unmute themselves.
I thought I
They're all
turned
stuck.
off. Hold on. Allow for, oh,
Ah,
I thought I apologize. I thought I had turned that back off and I was looking at the check the wrong way. Now you can. My apologies. I meant to do that right away and I thought I did.
should we go back to Dr. Bartholomew?
Yes, please.
We're like, what's the
Hi.
problem?
Yeah, sorry. What I wanted to say is at our university, I'm at Dominican University, and I'm currently looking at this work because we also want to add the ESN credential to our programming. And so what I saw, just looking at the curriculum and so on, it's not a lot being discussed about TBI. And I think it's because in general in our practice, as our presenter presented today, it's not something that is just explored enough. I can say my background as a behaviorist, it was dealt with, right? Because we had to talk about that all the time when we're assessing and so on, and we have to do these deeper dives when we're doing those assessments. But as we look into this classroom setting, to be quite frank, a lot of these individuals are in Gen Ed, not being looked at and just looked at as a disciplinary problem and so on. And so I think now we're starting to kind of really address the issue. And I think for us, what I'm seeing is I am now trying to put that together for our programming, right? And so this is going to be very helpful, but I'm also looking at who else can I partner with in this work, right? So at our university, we have a nursing team who can help us like with the specialized healthcare plans. And we have a new physician's assistant team that's coming on, and we have OTs and so on, right? So it's like, I feel like we have to have that collaborative practice and model. And so that's what I want to infuse, but I also want to stay away from how we traditionally want to create things like in these separate silos, right? So it has to be something that we thread through all the courses, right? So I want to make sure I'm including that in all of the foundational courses, as well as things that we're building for the new credential program. But I think having those standards, the TPEs, that really is pushing that work now. And that's really nice to see that it was included, because a lot of times it's been excluded. So this is really cool. So that's where we're at Dominican. This is what I'm spending my summer working on. So thank you, Kaylene. This is great information, great resources for me to include in my proposal for presentation for this. Thank you.
Absolutely. And feel free to reach out if you want to chat.
Definitely.
That continuum is so important because a lot of it can live in Gen Ed and will stay in Gen Ed and never need sped. And then sometimes we need to do those 504s, ADA, accommodation.
Exactly.
It's different. So it really does become that Pandora's box. But I think raising that awareness, and I love that you touched on the discipline, because so often, again, I play in secondary and alternative high school a lot. And it's like, well, let's see, I get that everybody's pretty hot right now. Let's calm, let's regulate, and let's try to get underneath it and understand, right? So I think bringing in the brain injury lens consistently when I'm working with my marginalized population, my different areas where there's a different SES status, I see a lot of hidden brain injury that wasn't done. And if I link those antecedent interventions and I really do that neurodevelopmental lens, as opposed to all these other attributions, we get growth and success for the student. And that's what gives me joy and helps fill my bucket to keep doing what I'm doing. So
awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, you all. What else?
Annie, are we okay to do that last question before we?
Yes, question and comment. Question first. Dr. Case, how can we access to the information you are about to share, those asynchronous videos and all those hyperlink? So that's my questions.
Okay.
My comments is about this because I'm a gen ed teacher as well as special ed teacher. And I will tell you, the first thing is the hardest thing of all, which is to recognize the needs and knowing that the students are not giving you a hard time. They are actually having a hard time. I think that part is the hardest one to educating our colleagues, whether it's in Gen Ed camp or in special ed camp, because we have many students, they are teaching in an inclusive classroom. So like you said, the student suffer TBI can be in gen ed or in the special ed setting, but they are our children. So I think recognize and relate and help them learning about social emotional learning, that self-awareness and social awareness have become very, very important. So tie that into it, become very important. And I believe when we know better, we can do better.
Beautifully said. Thank you for sharing. Two things on the slide deck you were given today. If you go to my resources, I have a whole bunch of video links for you and lots of information to start diving. And then I'm customizing a specific training with Amy. So she'll share the information on how you get the synchronized learning, and we'll just dive into some real specific things to grow capacity. That's what I'm about, systems and growing capacity for prevention to help kids learn. So.
Yeah, and just so that everybody kind of knows, so when we refer to those asynchronous resources and videos, those are going to be available. We have, we're adding resources to an existing website that's through the CSU Chancellor's Office, but available to everybody, no matter what your affiliation is. And that will be, we'll launch that probably late summer, and are going to get that link out to the same networks where we shared information about this webinar, are going to get the information as soon as that website is launched or relaunched. It's there, but thank you.
Having a brown bag lunch with me. Please don't hesitate to reach out. You've got my contact information. Amy's here, the team's here. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity. So.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you to Cedar for supporting this work.
Thank you so much for coming. This was so helpful. And thank you, Dr. Case, for this excellent, excellent presentation and all the resources you've already given us. Jenny.
Could I please make an announcement about the next community of practice?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
All right, June 30th, it's a Thursday, 11:30 to 1. We'll send out all the information to everybody who's here, as well as, of course, other folks. And it is featuring James Webb, who is the consultant at CTC for the TPA. The topic is TPA. Lots and lots of people asked for us to have a session on that. So please come and join us then, and we'll be sending out a registration link soon. Hope to see you there. And thank you, Dr. Case, just personally from me. That was so fabulous.
Well,
That was amazing.
Amazing.
I look forward to answering any other questions that come up. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks, everyone.